Hi, and welcome back. I'd like to start today by identifying a theme in many people's life advice. For instance, in the movie Harvey, Elwood P. Dowd delivers this line:
"In this world, Elwood, you must be oh so smart, or oh so pleasant."
Similarly, Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "For me, I am driven by two main philosophies. Know more today about the world than I knew yesterday, and along the way, lessen the suffering of others." Another Neil Gaiman, echoed the evaluations of human resources departments everywhere by saying,
"But people keep working because their work is good, and because they're easy to get along with, and because they deliver the work on time. And you don't even need all three. 2 out of 3 is fine."
For now, we can ignore the final of the three as just being a matter of when people do the first two things. He said you only need 2 anyway.
People will forgive the lateness of your work if it's good and they like you.
And finally, British comedian John Finnemore delivers his life advice.
1. Be kind. 2. Have fun.
Okay, so have fun is initially a little bit of an outlier, but we might be able to jam that square peg into a round hole by remembering that having fun might depend on your sense of humor, which is correlated with your level of intelligence, on which your knowledge depends. And be kind definitely fits. So what Elwood, Neil, and John have identified is that we tend to evaluate ourselves and others across 2 broad dimensions. Social psychologists refer to these dimensions as warmth and competence, and have referred to them as the universal dimensions of social cognition. Susan Fiske formalized these dimensions into a stereotype content model that predicts what kinds of prejudices people will think and feel towards certain groups based on their rated warmth and competence. People perceived as high on just warmth are often liked but pitied, evoking feelings of paternalistic condescension accompanied by disrespect. People seen as high on just competence are often envied or resented. People perceived as low on both can evoke contempt, whereas high ratings of both warmth and competence are reserved for, or in-group, the people who are most like you and closest to you. These dimensions also predict whether or not you'd be likely to help or harm people. People are more likely to try to actively harm those that are seen as competent but not warm, but they also let themselves be associated with them passively. Whereas those who are viewed as warm but not competent are more likely to elicit helping behaviors, but they're also more likely to be ignored. This model is complicated by the fact that everyone identifies with multiple groups. For example, cis male, white, musician, psychologists, to name a few. And though it's often easy to see many of our own groups, with others, a single group identification is often highlighted by context. If I meet someone at a conference for psychologists, I'm more likely to think of them as just a psychologist regardless of the other groups they identify with. And focusing attention on just a single group identification can allow people to believe the literally impossible. To illustrate this, we're going to consider 2 groups that are frequently stereotyped as high on competence but low on warmth: accountants and feminists. First, consider Bill. Bill is 34 years old. He's intelligent but unimaginative, compulsive, and generally lifeless. In school, he was strong in mathematics but weak in social studies and humanities. After describing him like this, the researchers who were studying Bill asked people to rank which items on this list were most likely to be true about him. They were curious whether or not they could cue stereotyped representations about him. However, they were particularly interested in 2, whether or not he played jazz for a hobby, and whether or not he was an accountant who also played jazz. The thing about these 2 is, no matter what you said about Bill before, one of them has to be more likely. If you consider all the people who are jazz musicians and all the people who are accountants, any overlap of those 2 groups has to be smaller than the group of all the jazz musicians. This is called the conjunction rule. If you have 2 groups that overlap, the overlap has to be at least as small as either of the 2 original groups. But still, 87% of people rated him more likely to be in the group that combined the 2 traits than to be just a jazz musician. 87%! The description of Bill was enough to evoke a representation of him so clear that being a jazz musician was not just unlikely, but impossibly unlikely. This mistake, breaking the conjunction rule, is called the conjunction fallacy. The same thing happened in a similar experiment regarding Linda. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination inclusion and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. When presented with this list of possible traits, 85% of people thought it was more likely for Linda to be a bank teller and an active feminist than to be just a bank teller. It evokes a stereotypic representation of Linda so strong that people think she could not possibly be a bank teller unless she was also active in the feminist movement. After finding this, the researchers began what they called a series of increasingly desperate manipulations designed to induce subjects to obey the conjunction rule. They gave these tasks to doctoral students who had taken several advanced courses in probability and statistics. 83% made the same mistake with Bill and 85% with Linda. They thought maybe having all these other items on the list was too confusing, so they removed them so that only these two remained. 85% still thought the conjunction was more likely. They offered people a choice of which argument was more accurate, hoping to bypass numbers entirely to just get to the reasons behind them. Number 1. Linda is more likely to be a bank teller than she is to be a feminist bank teller, because every feminist bank teller is a bank teller, but some bank tellers are not feminists, and Linda could be one of them. Number 2. Linda is more likely to be a feminist bank teller than she is likely to be a bank teller, because she resembles an active feminist more than she resembles a bank teller. 65% still picked the latter. If they were told they could win $10 by picking the more likely outcome, 56% still made the same error, even if you clarify by saying Linda is a bank teller whether or not she is active in the feminist movement. A majority still say that's less likely than the conjunction. One test seemed to dramatically reduce this error. Participants were asked to imagine that there were 100 people who fit the description, and then report how many of the 100 were bank tellers or feminist bank tellers. In this case, a majority of people report that the conjunction is less likely than the more broad category that doesn't fit the stereotype conjured by this description. Some people propose that this manipulation works because frequencies are just inherently easier to understand than probabilities. And some even argue that everyone was right all along because of subtleties of frequentist probability theory. It's not even a logical error. Still, it's hard to argue that stereotypic representation doesn't play a role. For example, there's evidence that children show less of this error, even though it arguably requires more advanced logic. And in the original study, one participant said after acknowledging the logical error, "I thought you only asked for my opinion." People can recognize their own judgment of these groups isn't based in logic, but they don't necessarily acknowledge the role that stereotype representations play in creating these impossible judgments of likelihood. And although this is a logical error, it's an error that's a result of bias from stereotypes, and one that's surprisingly common. 85% of people who would probably make this mistake. It's important to be able to recognize when these stereotypes are shaping your perception of people you don't know, and acknowledging when we have made errors like this is an important part of being oh so pleasant.
Well, for years I was smart. I recommend pleasant.
Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Whereas high ratings of both Worf... I rate you highly on your degree of Worf from Star Trek: The Next Generation.